I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the School of Business at the George Washington University, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this session of George Talks Business. I'm also very delighted to introduce very distinguished guests today. First, to my left is Brandon Wales, Executive Director at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and then Scott Smith, Partner and Principal in the consulting practice of Ernst & Young, and Scott leads the EY Government and Public Sector Cybersecurity practice. Thank you very much, both of you, to be here today as guests.
No, thank you, Manish.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we have received many questions, and I will try to incorporate many of them into my questions as well, but we will have a chance for some Q&A at the end. But let's just jump in. Brandon, for those who don't know, can you explain what CISA does, and how did we get here?
Sure, that's a good question. So the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has what I would say is two key responsibilities in the government. First, a very broad mission to be the national coordinator for U.S. government-wide critical infrastructure, security, and resilience efforts. So we work across with the various federal agencies that have a role in that mission, with our public sector, our private sector partners, state and local governments, to make sure that we're moving in the same direction to tackle the biggest challenges we face in the critical infrastructure community. The second big part of our mission is our cyber defense mission, and that where we really serve as the nation's cyber defense agency. That means providing information into the cybersecurity community to help advance the role that network defenders can play to protect their systems. It means working with our federal civilian executive branch agencies to make sure that federal networks are hardened against the threats that they face. And it means trying to promote a more secure cyber ecosystem, both in the United States, working with the public and private sector, but globally, working with international partners around the world.
That's great. Sounds very important, of course, and is. Scott, could you tell us a little bit about your role at EY?
Sure, yeah, and again, thanks for having me. So I work at a company called Ernst & Young, or EY. I lead the cybersecurity practice specific to the government and public sector. So that includes organizations like Brandon's, like Department of Homeland Security. It also includes state and local entities, and then it also includes higher education, so universities as well. So that's the industry sector I'm focused on, and then we cover a wide range of cyber capabilities, kind of cover the waterfront in terms of cyber.
Great. So again, thank you both for being here today. So Brandon, tomorrow is the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I want to know what we have learned over the past year about cyber defense here in the United States. Is our critical infrastructure still facing the same level of threat as we faced a year ago?
Sure. So let me start with the end of your question, which is, does the critical infrastructure face the same level of threat? And what I would argue is that the critical infrastructure of this country is at a persistent level of threat all the time, not just from Russian cyber actors that want to compromise our systems, but from a wide range of other hostile nations, including China, that are constantly looking for ways into our critical infrastructure because they want to hold our critical infrastructure at risk to potentially affect U.S. decision-making geopolitically and globally. But there are, I think, important lessons that we've learned from Ukraine. I think the most important one is that incremental improvements in cybersecurity can pay huge dividends. So between 2014 and the invasion in February 2022, Ukraine made kind of small but steady progress on their cyber defenses as a country. And I think we saw very early on that those improvements actually paid real dividends. Russia was not able to achieve significant cyber effects inside of Ukraine during the invasion, and they have increasingly relied upon barbaric kinetic attacks to disrupt critical infrastructure and to really try to demoralize the Ukrainian people. And we have tried to take those lessons here domestically, that you do not need to be perfect. You don't need to have the level of the most sophisticated cyber defense operators in order to make it more difficult for an adversary to get into your network and to put yourself in a position where you're more able to defend and respond quickly if something happens. I think the second is we saw real improvements in our ability to work collaboratively with private sector, with industry, when we're facing some type of specific and real emergent challenge. And so very early on, we worked with our private sector, including the major technology companies, the major cloud companies, the major cybersecurity vendors, to see how we can more quickly share information, how we can quickly have real-time awareness of what's happening in the ecosystem so that collectively we can take action at scale. No one individually can really deal with the amount of cyber threats we're facing. And so it requires us to work collaboratively together to pool all of our resources, all of our expertise, all of our unique access, so that we can actually make a measurable progress against the cyber threats.
So we're certainly going to explore that in the partnership and collaboration a little bit more later on, because there were lots of questions around that were submitted. But from what you're describing, what may be some of the weaknesses still that you are looking at from your perspective, from your lens?
Sure. So I'll kind of cover this in kind of two fronts. One is what we're seeing in terms of our adversary space, the capability enhancements and what we're seeing there, and then also our concerns about the nature of the technology ecosystem that drives some of this. So in our adversary, among our adversaries, we're seeing a dramatic increase in capability to the point where we have, in some cases, less insight into their cyber activities against the United States because their tradecraft is improving. They're better able to hide in legitimate traffic. They're hiding in the vast number of cyber criminal activity that's happening across cyberspace. And so those types of advanced nations are able to do things on network that they were not able to do 5 to 10 years ago, or were much more easily detectable 5 to 10 years ago. I think second, we've seen the dramatic rise in cybercriminal capabilities, both fueled by payments from ransomware and also fueled by this new ecosystem where ransomware operators don't need to be that sophisticated because they can rely upon shared services, where US companies have infrastructure as a service and compute as a service. Well, the criminals are now using ransomware as a service, where I don't need to be a sophisticated actor if I can just rent time and pay a small amount of my criminal proceeds over to another group who's developing more sophisticated tools to gain access to networks. And that has fueled, I'd say, a dramatic rise in cyber activity hitting small and medium-sized businesses, communities, hospitals, schools, what we call the kind of target-rich cyber poor part of our critical infrastructure. And so that is the nature of the threat. But a lot of this is underpinned by technology weaknesses. We have technology that is not secure by design, that is complicated for particularly small and medium-sized businesses to operate in a secure way. And these technology weaknesses have kind of amplified the risks we face in critical infrastructure in ways that we don't accept in other parts of our community. We would not accept, if a car was provided to us that completely misfunctioned. But we regularly accept software that has numerous vulnerabilities that could be exploited by adversaries to have real consequences on the American people. And so part of that is going to require real change in paradigm about what our expectations are on the technology community and what we can do to really change the nature of how secure we are as a country.
So those are great points there, and I want to turn to Scott as well to look at it from the corporate perspective as well. He's talking about so much on the national security type of aspects here, but data suggests that 77% of the companies I was reading somewhere saw an increase in disruptive attacks in just the last 12 months, and I believe that is up from close to 60% a year before that. And majority of the executive survey do not know whether their defenses are strong enough for hackers' new strategies, for example. So in your view, what are some of the most common vulnerabilities that companies must address?
Yeah, so a few things. One, I think the volume increase that Brandon mentioned, I think that's, in Russia-Ukraine, by the way, that situation just escalated the volume, so that's real. Ransomware as a service is a great example of just the increase of attacks. So I believe all those stats. I think they're very real. In terms of strategies, I think you have to start with, you can't protect everything the same way, so you have to determine what is most important to you as an organization, whether it's government or otherwise. So I think you have to start with that kind of risk lens. Again, recognizing you can't protect everything the same way, so you got to make decisions on where you're going to put energy and what are you going to protect more than something else. Your question about critical infrastructure is a good example of, and by the way, we see that a lot in state and local. So think of every transportation entity that every state is responsible for, and roads and bridges and the metro that I took this morning. I mean, these are all critical infrastructure, physical assets that are managed different than a back office, HR or IT or finance. These are different systems. They have different vulnerabilities. You need a different approach towards infrastructure than you would towards, sort of back office IT. So it gets complicated quick. And I think, again, those stats you mentioned in news, that's just an increase everywhere from a cyber perspective.
So what are some of the common mistakes that companies are making still in trying to design their, cybersecurity infrastructure?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is it seems, and I don't know why this is, but some organizations just don't prepare. They don't plan for it. We conducted a survey recently, and 40% have no sort of exercise function. They don't simulate a cyber event. They don't simulate what happens after a cyber event happens. I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's not, if something's going to happen from a cyber perspective, but when. And therefore, if you accept the fact that you're going to have a cyber event, then you need to be prepared on how to respond. And we've worked with clients to go through the whole simulation. And by the way, it's not just a security concern. You have the business unit, whoever owns the business function. You have a public affairs entity. You have legal. You have all kinds of, by the way, if you have cyber insurance, you have a group that would need to, hey, do we execute cyber insurance? You have a interface with federal entities like DHS and FBI. I mean, all these things come into play, and when a cyber event happens is not the time to be trying to figure that out for the first time.
So you mentioned cyber insurance. What does cyber insurance buy a company? At the end of the day, if once you have been attacked, then what does it buy? How valuable is it?
So I think it depends. Is the quick answer. I think it depends on the insurance policy, but in my mind, the best part of cyber insurance is that it gets help right away. Mm-hmm. It gets immediate mitigation, hands-on keyboard, put the fire out. Mm-hmm. And that there's value in that. What it typically does not do, and I say typically because I'm sure there's other scenarios, but it typically doesn't address the restore function. How long it takes to sort of stand everything back up. We worked with an organization where they had a serious cyber event, and that was maybe a 2-week immediate put the fire out, and then it took a year mm-hmm. to restore all the functions. And that's the part that I think people don't think about when they go down the cyber insurance path.
Yeah. So let me turn to the supply chain side of it. During the pandemic, we saw how supply chain disruption can be so difficult to be able to handle. Should we be really especially concerned with cyber threats to supply chain, and how can we mitigate some of that?
Absolutely. And I think you see that in the federal landscape a lot. I mean, President Biden's cyber executive order from 2021, May of 2021, specifically highlighted supply chain risk management and the need to understand the supply chain, to understand when you buy a software product, what are the bill of materials that make up that software product. And that includes everything from foreign ownership to cyber risk. There's all kinds of different risks that apply to a supply chain, and I think it's a critical area for organizations to look at.
So what are some of the proactive measures that companies are taking to mitigate that?
Well, right out of the gate is you should figure out what you have.
Yeah.
What is your current landscape of products in your environment? So that's number one. Number two is you got to analyze, so who makes up these companies? And they're very complex typically. It's seldom do you get a company that's just a standalone entity. They're normally subsidiaries, they're global entities. So it gets complicated very quickly, but I think number one, figure out what you have. Number two, do a rapid assessment and try to, again, you can't protect everything the same. Mm-hmm. So do the same thing with your software, your list of vendors, and figure out who's got more risk and who doesn't. And there's ways to do that very quickly.
Well, thank you for that. And Brandon, many business leaders, even today, I think of their organization cybersecurity as an information technology issue. But in today's evolving digital threat environment, is this still how we should be approaching cybersecurity from an enterprise level?
Yeah, no, I think Scott hit this point well, which is, in many cases, cybersecurity needs to be thought of as a core business risk, mm-hmm. not as just an IT problem that could be managed separately. If the board of directors does not understand what their preparedness is, doesn't understand what steps have been taken to get their company ready, doesn't understand the intricacies of how cyber insurance would actually work in the context of their corporate enterprise, the time to figure that out is not after you've been hit by a major incident. And I think it is long past time. We've had enough wake-up calls. We would have assumed things like Colonial Pipeline, like JBS Foods, like SolarWinds would have shown corporate America that they're not immune from the cybersecurity challenges we're facing, and that they could be really existential for corporate reputation. So we have been trying to push this notion of kind of corporate cyber responsibility, that as business leaders, you have both a responsibility to your kind of core business interest and also to the broader cyber ecosystem that you are part of, to make sure that you're doing everything you can to make sure that your company is prepared and ready to be respond. And that technology companies, as described, have kind of an additional special responsibility as part of that community. We're working with places like the National Association of Corporate Directors to say, how can we feed more information into the boardroom so that they understand, can ask the right questions of their team, so that when they bring together the CISOs, the business leads, the legal, the general counsels, that they know how to harness all of those different tools that will need to come together to make sure the company is prepared and has the ability to respond effectively and efficiently.
Great. I would just add to that real quick. I think the good news is there's less of a stigma now, I think, if you have a cyber event. I would say in the last 5 years, that sort of hide it, hey, I had a cyber event, I'm not going to tell anyone, like that has gone away a little bit, which I think is great, because that promotes sharing. Hey, this happened to us. How did you guys solve it? It encourages coordination with federal entities to help solve it. I heard someone at a conference describe, what if the government could respond to a cyber event like they would a natural disaster? So there's a hurricane in New Orleans, FEMA's there to help, right? And they're viewed as help. I think the same kind of dynamic would apply. Hey, you're a company, you had a cyber event, you did your best to sort of avoid it, you have measures in place. How can the government kind of come and be viewed as a helpful?
So should there be policies for companies to actually have to divulge if they have a cyber event?
So there are.
So there is,
Brandon,
yeah.
You can speak
Yeah,
to that
so
better.
Congress actually passed this in March of last year. The Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act that will require companies to, who are identified, who are covered by the regulation, to tell the government, tell CISA that they have been compromised. We're actually in the middle of the rulemaking process now. We actually, we had a public RFI, started collecting information, and we will be issuing the notice of proposed rulemaking sometime before March of 2024. So that will happen, and we do think it's important because, as much as there has been a less of a stigma, we and the FBI still think we only know about 30% of the cyber incidents that happen domestically right now. So we think that there is a gap in helping us to understand what exactly is happening in the U.S. cyber ecosystem, where are those threats, how are they evolving, and also how we can better measure the effectiveness of various programs and mitigations we're putting in place. Are they having an effect on the prevalence of different strains of ransomware, for example? Without this kind of data, we're not able to see as clearly what's actually happening. And so we think over time, as this regulation goes into effect, over the next several years, it will increase both our understanding, our ability to provide aid when we need to, and help us just better understand what's happening.
Well, thank you for that. And Scott, we hear a lot about zero trust. What does zero trust mean in today's cybersecurity community, and how can we actually help our employees in the corporate world, or in the government for that matter, to be trained to better protect from cybersecurity threats?
Yeah, great question. Can't have a cyber conversation without talking about zero trust. Zero trust is one of my, as buzz phrases go, it's one of my favorites, and for a couple of reasons. One, I think it encourages a certain mindset around cyber, that don't trust anyone and always verify. So right out of the gate, I think it promotes that kind of way of thinking about cyber, which is great. Number two is zero trust is really a framework on how to approach cyber, and it's made up of 5 or 6 pillars depending on what zero trust framework you're using. And it's a great way, I think, for organizations to sort of break down and sort of look at these different pillars to help better attack the cyber situation. And by the way, DHS, I think, does a great job, not only post an event in terms of helping a disaster, but pre, when it comes to, hey, here's a maturity model to help you understand where are you on this kind of zero trust journey, because it's, again, zero trust encompasses everything basically in cyber. So it's, whenever you hear someone say, well, we're zero trust compliant or something like that, that's kind of a tough thing to say, right? Because it's all of cyber. So it's but again, I'm an advocate of it. It's, by the way, it's been around for 10 plus years. It's just gained a lot of traction, which I think is great in the last couple of years within the federal space in particular.
And I do think it highlights a number of areas that we have seen repeatedly being exploited by adversaries, in particular areas related to identity management on your network, over and over again, we've seen the adversaries, the way that they're able to get onto networks cleanly, avoid detection, is by compromises to the identity management infrastructure. So a lot of zero trust is upfront. What are you doing to make sure that you can authenticate every new hardware and every individual operating on that network? And the second is kind of segmentation. Kind of the key steps in the attack chain that adversaries are going to use is to kind of look for weaknesses and then move around the network. Well, the more you put up barriers to being able to move easily between various parts of network without additional authentication, the more secure you're going to be against the most significant types of attacks that we see.
So I understand that at least with this attitude, one could be looking at it from a corporate world or from an organization's perspective to be protecting. But technology has really infiltrated every aspect of our lives, And so from an individual level, quite often people just don't know what threats there are. I don't know how we have gotten so far with this, and where do we go from here? From how to protect from what somebody may be doing on an individual level without even knowing what the threat protection should be.
Yeah, so this goes back to kind of what I mentioned before about the obligation on technology companies to develop software and hardware that is more secure by design, secure by default, easier to configure and operate. If a lot of technology is being used by small and medium-sized businesses, individuals, if it is incredibly cumbersome to put in place the basics of security, to configure it in a secure way, well, it's not useful. And I think, unfortunately, today, the technology industry is measured by cost, performance, and speed to market. They're not measured by security. We don't, there's not a demand for companies to only write code in memory-safe programming languages that avoid a lot of the most common malware that's out there. So there are companies that are trying to move in that direction to make it easier to, for example, require all customers to use multi-factor authentication by default as opposed to turning it on. And I'll use one statistic. A major technology company has indicated that its enterprise customers, only 30% have multi-factor authentication enabled on enterprise cloud accounts. That's, insane in kind of modern era where lack of protection and identity management authentication is the number one pathway that adversaries are using onto networks. So I think there is an obligation. I think we're trying to work with technology companies to highlight the practices that we think are most important. The forthcoming national cyber strategy will highlight some additional areas that the U.S. government is going to recommend to make improvements in this ecosystem. But I do think it is going to be one that we need to think across both the academic community, the business community, the government, for how we work together to make this a more secure technology ecosystem.
Well, it seems to be working at GW quite well, because I sometimes cannot even remember how to get into my own accounts, despite having all these kind of authentication. But let me explore this a little bit more with you, Scott. Social engineering, attacks appear to be one of the most common data breaches first, where the data breaches start. So are companies actually allocating enough resources? And if not, why not? And if yes, why are they occurring?
Well, it's a tough problem to solve, to be honest. Social engineering is something that it's very tricky to defend against. By the way, on the multi-factor authentication, for everybody in the room, use multi-factor authentication. On your Gmail, whatever you're using, use multi-factor. Make it a little bit harder. I think on the social engineering question, and we work with clients a lot on this, which is a simulation that's called red team testing. So when you do a red team test, typically you're saying, hey, we're going to give you a trophy, see if you can come into our organization and find this trophy or this piece of data, whatever it is. And typically when we do this, we do a social engineering campaign. And we look through open source, Facebook, what have you, to find information about people that work there. And then you hit that vulnerable human being, right? You start with the human side. So technology can only go so far on that. And I'm sure most of you, or in most organizations, they do some kind of training, sort of broad training, don't click on the link kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Numbers show maybe 7% of people still click on the link. You do another training campaign, maybe you get that down to 3 or 4%, but you still have people clicking on the link, right? Mm-hmm. So you're never going to win that. That's not something you win, I don't think, from a social engineering perspective, but you do it in a layered way. You do the broad training. You recognize that at all times there's always a bad actor in your network. You just assume that out of the gate, and therefore you have monitoring in place, you have endpoint detection, you have all the tools you can. And again, you invest your resources on what you need to protect the most. Because the challenge with all this is, and it's not really fair sometimes to smaller companies and technology firms, they don't have the resources to implement super mature security. So it's this balance of we're trying to bring in innovation from smaller companies, but we also expect them to have some very structured cyber defense. So there's a balance there, I think.
So let me actually follow up on that from a personal experience here and take it down to that individual level. I get so many times the warnings and reminders to change my passwords, and oftentimes we ignore them. We don't, and we also have been like somewhat, I don't know if there are any alternatives to alphanumeric passwords. Is there going to be another way of protecting ourselves?
I think there's all kinds of options that are being sort of advanced, whether it's biometrics or other things like that. Change your password, Anush. Do that make sure I get that out. Because there are technologies that are tracking keystrokes, right? So you could change it, but they're tracking the keystrokes on your machine. So
Right.
again, you never win that. So you might as well make it harder, right? Multi-factor, change your password. I think there's new concepts around different ways to, different biometrics that might be used to sort of get away from passwords in general.
Yeah. So let me go back to this whole concept with COVID, and the subsequent lockdowns moved us from physical spaces to cyberspace a lot more. And many organizations have decided to keep their workforce in a hybrid mode. How bigger is this challenge because of this transition to hybrid work from the perspectives of cybersecurity?
Yeah, hard to put a number on that, but it's definitely bigger. The aperture is wider. I mean, people are working from home networks, they're working out of Starbucks or whatever the case may be, so there's just more vulnerabilities by definition. So I think it has changed the game. I think the work from home environment has just increased risk.
Yeah, I would say in two ways. The attack surface has increased because everyone working from home, the number of kind of devices that are operating outside of core company networks is beginning to increase. Companies are increasingly relying upon things like virtual private networks to enable their business, and you immediately start seeing a pivot from the adversaries to targeting those devices. Researching, looking for vulnerabilities, and then once they're in those networks, bam, now they're able to expand and move. And so I think that is one. And I think second is it definitely changed the nature and the stress on corporate IT and security offices that now are managing a much different, much more complicated network. And again, adversaries are exploiting those weaknesses to advance their aims. And so I think as companies move in this direction and as they've have moved, they need to think hard about what this means for their level of risk, how they're going to mitigate these new risks, what kind of protections they have around these new key parts of their network, like these new edge devices that didn't exist 5 years ago, what kind of logging they have around them, what type of monitoring, are those sufficient against kind of modern threats. So it does change the nature of how companies need to secure their networks, and the best companies are the ones who recognize that early and are taking aggressive action.
Great. So in a couple of minutes, we are going to take some questions from the audience here. If you do have a question, please do go to the mic so that I know that you'll be asking a question. But let me continue with actually asking a submitted question from Anjishnu, who was asking about the role of artificial intelligence in ensuring cybersecurity, in the coming years. But let me change it a little bit and say artificial intelligence could also be creating more cybersecurity risks. So tell us a little bit from your perspectives, the risk versus the ability for AI to be actually able to mitigate those risks.
Yeah, I can start, Brandon. I think it cuts both ways, right? I think AI, and when I hear AI, by the way, I sort of lump in machine learning, predictive analytics, kind of what comes with that. On the good side of the coin here, I think there's a lot of benefits of AI in terms of helping with cyber. So imagine you could look at user behavior and say, hey, based on this person's behavior, they have more access than, Brandon mentioned identity and access. Maybe they have more access than they should, and we can remove access that they don't need. So I think that's very helpful. The risk with AI and machine learning is a few things. One, by definition, all machine learning is working off of an existing data set effectively, and is trying to predict the future based off of a data set, and it's using models and it's training the model to do a prediction target of some sort. So recognize that you're making a decision based off of some data set. Two, I think it's important to understand what you're trying to predict, and then moreover, what are you going to do with the answer to that? Mm-hmm. So you could, the opportunity for AI and machine learning is sort of limitless because it's kind of, you're trying to predict the next thing, but you really do need to understand what you're trying to predict, how you're going to use that information, and oh, by the way, make sure there's a human in the loop, especially if it's you're dealing with a citizen or a warfighter or your mission space. Like, you have to be really careful with sort of assuming the algorithm and the data just going with it.
Great.
Yeah, so I would agree with everything that Scott said, and note that like any other technology, it can be used by both the good guys and the bad. And we already see that today. We see adversaries using polymorphic malware that mutates as it moves through networks, so that even if it's detected the first time, it won't be detected again because it's now changed. We use AI on our end to do the kind of predictive analytics to see if we can discover adversary behavior that we've not seen before. If we don't have a clear signature and know that it's bad, but we can use behavioral analytics and other machine learning techniques, and that will continue to grow. I do think one of the areas that this is likely to be most significant from a threat perspective is the use of AI to kind of turbocharge disinformation and misinformation campaigns. I think we already see that today with some of the work related to deep fakes, et cetera. That's only going to grow, and I would say, like a lot of technology, we don't really know where this is going to be in 10 years. I think we're all going to be surprised at how malicious actors are going to utilize some of this technology in the coming years, and we need to make sure that we're as prepared as possible against it.
Yeah, I think you guys are scaring me a lot, so let me take the question from the audience now. Please state your name and ask your question.
My name is Casey Berger. I was wondering, what do you think is like the most difficult thing that you face on a day-to-day basis?
Good question.
Sure. So, I'll start and just say, I think the most difficult thing is probably the best thing about the job, which is that no 2 days are the same. I could be dealing one day with trying to manage issues associated with Russian invasion of Ukraine and how we're working with industry to be prepared, and the next day we could be dealing with folks attacking critical electrical substations in the Carolinas for reasons that are still not necessarily clear. And it just means that we need to be on our toes. We need to be really adaptable and flexible and make sure that we've kind of built our programs that are able to address a threat environment that is incredibly dynamic. But it is something that definitely keeps me interested in every single day.
Yeah, I'll just add, I love the variety too of the different, I described the client set, dealing with federal organizations or state and local or universities. So I love the variety. I think that the challenging part for me sometimes is you work with clients that are sort of emotionally, physically under duress, right? We talked about the paranoia of cyber. I mean, you have clients that are very concerned, and as they should be, with human safety and things like that. I mean, cyber is very real. It becomes very real that way, so that's kind of a challenge. I'd say the other thing is, as someone in industry, it's sort of how to decide where to put resources. We've covered a lot of different cyber topics, and do you put more towards identity or to training or to awareness or whatever the case may be. So making those decisions can be challenging because it all seems important. So it's sort of where do you hone resources?
Thank you for that question as well. You had, Brandon, mentioned about partnerships between government and industry is key to some of this resilience that we need to develop. How do you see these partnerships evolving in 2023 and beyond?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say this is one of those buzzwords that's been overused for my entire career, public-private partnership. And I'd say about 2 years ago, we wanted to try to change the model from just public-private partnerships, sharing information, which usually meant sharing PDF files back and forth over email. And about 2 years ago, we stood up what we call the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. Initially started with the kind of key government agencies involved in cybersecurity, so CISA, the FBI, NSA, DOJ, DOD, and the intelligence community, together with the largest technology companies, those in cloud, cybersecurity, internet service providers, some of the key makers of equipment, who all have really broad visibility into the cyber ecosystem because they operate kind of very diverse networks. They collect telemetry from a lot of different sensors out there, and that individually, they each have a piece of the cybersecurity challenge, but no one has the whole thing. And so we brought this group together to say, how can we work more quickly and at scale? So we kind of road tested this initially during the discovery of the vulnerability in the Log4j software library that affected, frankly, millions of systems around the world. How could we get authoritative information on what that vulnerability meant, who was prepared, whether it was being utilized by adversaries. Then we moved right into the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where thanks to this kind of closer operational collaboration, we were able to kind of get initial strands of malware being used by Russia in Ukraine within hours, share it with this entire community in real time so that everyone can take action. And I'd kind of use an example. To get any individual water system in the United States to protect their network is hard. I mean, there are about 57,000 water utilities in the country. To get Microsoft to make a change in Windows Defender to protect hundreds of thousands of their customers is a lot faster. And so this kind of mindset of get information in real time, share it with the entire community who can use it to take action was a big change over the last 2 years. I'd say going forward, we've kind of outlined a planning agenda for this Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative that focuses on a couple different areas, things like systemic risks, including those in managed service providers, managed security service providers that, again, are servicing a very broad community, doing some dedicated work on the energy and water sectors that have some unique challenges but are so systemically critical to the operation of business and our way of life here, as well as looking at some novel areas, things like sensitive communities that are targeted, like journalists and human rights workers, et cetera, that have kind of a unique threat environment against them because of the work that they do. So have some real planning within this community to say, what can we do working together to actually make measurable progress going forward?
Great answer. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Shalon Baines.
Yeah, we can hear you.
My name is Shalon Baines. You guys, of course, are bringing up some really awesome points. And Brandon, you mentioned how business should think of cybersecurity as a core business risk. And just seeing how, of course, the past 3 years have been with COVID, how we needed to find, protection and things of that nature, mask, and that was all like a real-time experience. But in regards to just businesses overall, and thinking of how we think about protecting our infrastructures, how do we develop software and procedures that are useful and secure if we don't necessarily know about them? Like, what are some ways that you guys would suggest or think about, or things to think about, being the fact that we really don't know what we don't know? And like you mentioned, a lot of people are kind of in a state of paranoia, and it's a sense of, you say your biggest challenge is not knowing what you don't know. So I know that's a broad question, but if you can kind of just touch on those points.
Yeah, so I think it is a good point, because as much as possible, we want to kind of future-proof our technology to work against evolving threats that we don't fully understand today. So I think what we have put forward is the idea that regardless of the challenges you face, there are probably some core things we want you to do. So this was something we released late last year called our Cybersecurity Performance Goals, which said, if you don't do anything else in cyber, start working through this list of kind of core controls on your network, because they're going to move you from the I'm completely exposed to the I have some baseline level of protection, and I'll begin to understand what my network really is facing. There are things like multi-factor authentication. There are things like how do you think about segmenting your network. There are things related to, particularly if you're operating industrial control systems that operate kind of physical plant at factories or substations or water facilities. Kind of here are the kind of things, and we've ranked them in the order of providing insight in terms of cost and complexity and impact. So that you can think, if I've got a marginal dollar, which one will have the greatest impact with potentially the least complexity if I don't have sophisticated staff on board to take it all on. I would say going forward is kind of where we want to work with the research and academic community. Help us understand what are those kind of novel techniques that we can begin to develop against more sophisticated actors. And that's where we work with our Office of Science and Technology. We work with other federal agencies, with the academic community, to help seed the understanding in this community to say that we don't have all the answers today, and we need you to help think about that for the future. And while you're doing that, let's make sure that you're building those new technologies in the most secure and secure way possible. But Scott, you have
Yeah, just a quick add to that. Again, I don't think this is something you win. You know what I mean? Having that healthy paranoia, I think, is a good thing. And I think all organizations should have that, because again, you don't just put on a mask and you're good. Hence the reason for these zero trust frameworks, right? It's a way to break it down into sort of smaller pieces and to show maturity across a layered approach. So paranoia is not a bad thing in this case. It just keeps everybody on their toes, recognizing that you're right, we don't know what the next threat is. We can use all kinds of tools to try to predict it based off of known, but you're never going to win on that front.
On that great note there, let's have the next question.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Bridget Sunheim, and I'm wondering, cybersecurity is the greatest tool in our great power competition with Russia and China, and China's economy is only growing, which might be due to China's recent goals of appealing to U.S. multinationals. So I'm wondering how dangerous this interaction might be with American and Chinese companies, and how people in your roles or organizations might be trying to fight the dangers of that.
I'll start a little bit, Brandon. I think any nation state actor, whether it's China or otherwise, just view that as much more mature, much more sophisticated. The ability to do more attacks is just a greater risk. So I'm not sure I would put China in any other different category other than it's a nation state with a lot of resources. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a...
I would add that if an American company is doing business in China, subject to pretty intrusive Chinese cybersecurity laws requiring access to encryption keys, requiring reporting of vulnerabilities on those networks, requiring source code in a lot of cases, you need to think really hard about your operations there and the risk that those operations pose to, one, your business, and then two, the potential vector that those may be an entry point to potentially larger attacks on your enterprise. So doing business in China is kind of a unique threat to America, and we have seen the Chinese government exploit their access to U.S. companies to further their malicious aims. And I think we are only likely to see that grow. I will say that I do think we have seen businesses change tack on the Chinese market because of the potential broader concerns about Chinese behavior. But I would recommend that every company ask themselves a question, which is, what are you going to do as a company the day after China invades Taiwan? The same way that many companies ask themselves the day after Russia invaded Ukraine, am I going to continue to do business? Was it a good idea to do business in Russia and with Russia? And a lot of companies had to make real hard choices about how they got out of the Russian market because of their invasion. China has indicated that it wants to retake Taiwan. We don't have any indication that they're going to do that in the short term, but it is obviously a risk, and every company who does business with them needs to ask themselves how they're going to react if China's behavior mirrors that of Russia.
Which, by the way, is a tie to that supply chain risk management topic we were talking about. That's getting visibility to what nation states are operating the products in your environment.
Great.
So.
Let's have one last question for you.
Firstly, thank you guys for coming today. It's been super informative. I wanted to ask Scott, so as regulatory standards have changed over the past decade, do you think that a zero trust infrastructure is the best way for small organizations to meet compliance? And what do you think is the biggest limitations in organizations achieving zero trust? You mentioned those information sessions that organizations had and people were still clicking on links, those 3%.
Yeah, I'd say number one, I do think zero trust applies regardless of size of organization, right? It's a great framework to sort of break down how you're going to look at cyber. Now, that's not to say a small company has to be the most mature across the various pillars of zero trust, but I do think it's a great way to, again, focus the resources that you have. I think when you mentioned compliance, there's a bunch of different cyber regulations and requirements. I think those are great, again, as a starting point, but again, you don't necessarily have to do all of the security controls that are tied to a specific regulation. So I think, again, these are great sort of guidance. I'm very sympathetic to the smaller business, right, that doesn't have the resources to do everything. So you gotta pick your spots, you gotta prioritize, and I think using those frameworks and the various security control requirement lists is a way to do that.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Well, great, thank you. This has been a great discussion, but let me ask, so I'm going to take away change your passwords, use multi-factor authentication. Anything else that comes to mind that I should be doing other than not sharing my social security numbers and bank account numbers with anybody? That should be the takeaways from today.
I'm
for
glad
more
you're
resolution.
paranoid. You're sufficiently paranoid on the way out.
I was fine before I came into this session. Anything else that we should be that we should be thinking about in terms of individually that we should be looking at to protect our organizations? from
Update your
cyber attacks?
systems. So patching. Unfortunately, we live in an environment where new vulnerabilities are discovered in technology every day. If you don't keep on top of the latest patch to your iOS phone or your computer, that's an entry point. And I think individuals may say, well, China's not going to compromise me. But the cyber criminals are out there, and also we have seen over and over again where even nation states will use large attacks against lots of small individual victims, compromising home office routers, et cetera, to be part of a larger campaign. So you are part of the cyber ecosystem, whether you want to be or not, and you should take some action to make sure that we're as secure as possible.
Well, gentlemen, thanks again for being here and for a great discussion today, and we certainly hope to continue these conversations at the GW Business and Policy Forum, attacking cybersecurity threats on April 25th. And by the way, the early registration is now open for our alumni, for our faculty, staff, and guests, so please visit our website for more details. I would also like to thank all of you who have joined us in person as well as online, and invite you to the next George Talk session, a special edition, hosted in conjunction with the Howard Hoffman Distinguished Lecture Series at the Center for Entrepreneurial Excellence at the School of Business. On March 8th, we invite you to join us for a virtual panel discussion with this year's winners of Globant Awards, Women That Build Edition. This award recognizes women from all over the world who have made their careers in technology, manage innovation and collaboration, and promote diversity and inclusion. We look forward to that conversation and hope you can join us then. Thank you again.